How is everyone?
Good. Let us know when you're all set. Let us know when you're all set.
I'm ready.
You ready? You were born ready?
Born ready.
Everybody else ready?
Ready. Ready in the firing line.
Good evening. Welcome to the Planning Board Special Meeting of Monday, March 11th, 2024. Beginning with the emergency evacuation and health notifications in case of an emergency. There are two main exits out of the chambers. The first is to the left side of the stage, up the stairs, through the doorway, and down the stairway out the back side of the hall. The second is out the back of the chambers to the exit doorway, to the stairway, out the front of the town hall. Men's facilities are through the back of the chambers, past the stairway, around the corner on the right. The ladies' facilities are through the back door of the chamber, straight up the stairs and on the left. Please do not use the elevator in times of emergency. There were no meeting minutes or regular agenda, old business. Consider and discuss and act on 2023 land use legislation amendments to the zoning ordinance and subdivision regulations.
Yes. So I'll start, everyone. Good evening. One of the issues that everybody was talking about was with respect to whether you had to make these recommendations to the council or what would happen if you didn't. Also, the consistency with what the state law says regarding our zoning ordinance, which is amendments you're adopting, have to be consistent with our comprehensive plan. So I did a little research. I also, as I mentioned in that email, I met with Mike, Randy, and Anthony Colon, who's the town solicitor, to discuss this. We also had a conversation with Kelly Morris, who's another attorney in Rhode Island. She does planning, land use, and also is actively involved in a lot of these amendments that are going forward right now. So she's well versed in that area. But essentially, the short answer after looking at everything is the town is charged with having zoning ordinances that are consistent with the state law. Every local town and city derives their zoning from the state. So when the Enabling Act was enacted back in 1991, it basically, as I mentioned in my memo, stated that every town's zoning ordinance needs to be consistent with state law. So, although this is a little bit different, because now state law is telling you to adopt things inconsistent with your comprehensive plan, the first step in the process is being consistent with the state law. You really can't have zoning unless the state of Rhode Island provides it to you. So if the state of Rhode Island does a overarching general change to zoning, it's a mandate essentially from all of the towns and cities that they have to change their zoning to be consistent with that. If at that point you find that your zoning ordinance is inconsistent with your comprehensive plan, then you can work at some point on amendments to your comprehensive plan to be consistent with your zoning ordinance. I don't advise doing that right now because I have expectation there's going to be more changes at the state level with these zoning and planning state general laws. So there's probably going to be more changeover, turnover, and how things are. So I wouldn't go down that path yet, but looking into that side of it. For the most part, there's case law. The case law tries to look at every zoning ordinance in your town that zoning board or planning board now is relying upon, in an individual fact-based basis with your comprehensive. So generally, you can say the zoning ordinance is above your comp plan and the state law is above your zoning ordinance. But there are cases that sort of look at your decision at a zoning local level with your comprehensive plan to see if there's an inconsistency or consistency or how the board went about its decision. So I wouldn't necessarily, I don't want to give the overarching point that says your comprehensive plan gets overrode by your zoning ordinance. I think you'll have to wait for each individual case to come up and see if there's an inconsistency and try to adapt your zoning ordinance or comprehensive plan to make it all work together. That's what the state, that's what the judiciary has said. You're going to try to make your comp plan and your zoning ordinance work together. But before you do that, you're going to make sure your zoning ordinance is consistent with what the state does. If you don't adopt anything and say, you know, we're not providing it, you have to make a recommendation to the council. That's you're charged with that duty. If your recommendation is, we don't want to adopt it, that's fine. But then the town council still has to hold public hearings on these amendments, and the council still has the ultimate say what it's going to do. They will, I would say, most likely, according to an attorney, what Ron was saying is move forward with adopting these amendments because you need to be in consistency with the state law.
Thank you.
Clear
I-
as well?
Well, you know, it clears some issues in, you know, one of the things that, as the board members, you know, we had all this information before us, but we weren't sure what was vetted, what wasn't vetted within the town before it came before us. And at least it now has been vetted in terms of recommendations from council for this particular board as well as council for the town in terms of the interplay, which you know, some of us do not practice land use, some are not attorneys, so I think it was helpful to us to get an overview before we're asked to make recommendations. So I think that's helpful. We might not like what the answer is. We might agree to disagree on certain aspects, whether certain state zoning regulations talk mandatory language such as shall or may or silent, but in terms of that could be an issue that's addressed on another day by people who want to litigate the issue. So thank you very much for the time. Any questions of the board members to legal counsel for the board regarding these issues?
You were saying there was no case laws, right, to establish anything? Is that what you're saying, to fight up against something?
No, I said that there's case law that talks about the consistency and interplay between your zoning ordinance and your comprehensive plan. I didn't find the case that directly said your zoning ordinance override your comprehensive plan, because what's going to happen here is, once you make some of these amendments, you may have inconsistencies now with your comprehensive plan. But you'll still be the case, one of the cases I read talked about, as a board, you're still charged with trying to make those two documents work together to come to an ultimate decision on whatever happens.
Is there any argument, in other words, before you go, you have to have an argument, as you get in right, is there any argument about it? Is there anything we can argue to get into a case on it, or something to establish? Is there any way to argue it?
What, not have to follow these?
Correct.
There probably is. I mean, I think there's probably some basis to argue it, but the problem is it's not from this board's perspective. As a planning board, you really don't have the standing necessarily to make that argument, because all you're actually doing is making the recommendations. The council asks you to review all this stuff and give them the recommendation. It's almost like so they know what their planning board believes or thinks of it. This was more of an exercise as opposed to a substantive
Yeah, no, I realize we can't make the argument, the town has to make the argument.
Potentially the town could make that, but something like that is usually fought more at like a lobbyist level.
Right.
Like the League of
That's what I've been
Cities
establishing,
Or
kind of thing.
if there's a group of Rural Planners Association, or, I don't know, whatever, AARP, NAACP, somebody, like usually it's something like that for the broad overarching scope of this is usually done by some type of entity like that. If there was one particular item that was really at issue, that would be more developed once an application gets decided. So you don't like one of the amendments made, an application comes up that it deals with that particular amendment, you find there's an inconsistency or an issue, you deny it. That's the avenue for that particular item to get to Superior Court.
Well, what prompted part of the inquiry last session was we were talking about adaptive use. And reading the provision, it didn't appear to have mandatory language. It just talked about adaptive use. What is adaptive use? You know, when I read that particular portion of the statute, it wasn't saying a town needs to adopt an ordinance for adaptive use. Rather, it was a provision defining what adaptive use was. So that's what brought up part of the query at the time. I do understand, and I do not disagree with your opinion that state zoning will most likely, state regulation regarding zoning will trump comprehensive plan or town ordinance, that general proposition. I don't disagree at all in terms of your analysis. And again, thank you for that. The question is, does the zoning statute itself, where it speaks to issues, is that really mandatory language that each town must cover? With if the language is lacking, for example, one would expect with good legislative drafting in terms of issues of mandatory requirements, we would see each town shall or each town may. In some of those statutes that we're looking at are silent to that issue, and that's kind of what brought up my concern or inquiry.
So I think in one of the amendments, adaptive use was addressed as a permitted use in any zone.
That's the section of the law that they amended is permitted uses, and they added adaptive reuse under the listing of permitted uses in anywhere. So the thinking there is it's now listed as a permitted use, you therefore can't prohibit it in your community, and if you don't actually have something on your books, then you have no control over it. So you can't decide necessarily that it goes through a review process or that it's held to a certain set of standards. You'd only have the state law to rely on, which says it's permitted.
Michael?
So there's no choice. It has to be on our book.
I mean, you could, I suppose you could choose not to put it in your books, but
But it,
Are we required to adopt?
Your town, because it's under the state law as a permitted use, state is saying every town zoning shall have this or should have it. It's listed as a permitted use. What you have control of, she said, is within that permitted use, a review of it, what's going to be required, and make sure it goes through a development or land development project.
So what happens if we just say that it's not permitted, that they have to come to the planning board for review?
That would, if you said it was not permitted, it'd be inconsistent with the state zoning section. And then an applicant would say, state zone just says it's permitted, here it is, I'm going. So what you want to say is it's permitted, subject to.
Yeah, so not, maybe I'm using the wrong term, so whether it's by right or permitted, but I think they should, no matter what we want to call it, they should come here for a total review, because if not, and then we can choose whether or not, again, you know, Home Depot puts in a whole bunch of beds and we say, this isn't right for our town, then we're willing to fight that fight. Okay, but saying that it's permitted without them coming to us, I think that's dangerous.
So we did put in standards. We actually preferred that anyone using the adaptive reuse provision, we're sending them to your subdivision
Okay,
regulations, and we're saying that they're subject to the standards and review processes set forth in the subdivision regulations. So you'll be able to impose landscaping, lighting, like whatever requirements, whatever standards you have in there, you will, through the review process, be able to impose on a adaptive reuse. But you essentially, what the state has done is inserted that into your use table and put a bunch of Ps across the line, you know, by default, by authorizing it as a permitted use in the state law.
As a,
And-
from the adoption standpoint, how is this going to mention it as considered major land, are you referring to major land use development or minor?
So in the zoning provision, we don't specify, we just send you to the subdivision regulations. If you read the definitions of minor land development and of development plan review, they include adaptive reuse as one of the listed items, and actually it's in both. So there's a lot of confusion and discussion about minor land development versus development plan review and what the value is even there anymore for development plan review because of the changes they've made. It's almost exactly the same as a minor land development project. But the easiest way I think that we've come up with to do this is to just enable the adaptive reuse in the zoning ordinance and say that it's a permitted use. And then in the subdivision regulations, we're gonna talk about what the standards are. And the administrative officer has the authority to classify any project. So the administrative officer can look at the project and can say, based on the definitions of minor land development, the definitions of development plan review, I consider this an adaptive reuse project either as a minor land development or as a major land development if it's over the thresholds, or I suppose they could also tag it as a development plan review application, but it'll be one of those three depending on the scale of the project, because anything over 7,500 square feet of commercial floor area is a major. Anything over 9 residential units is a major. So any adaptive reuse project that is over one of those thresholds is going to go into the category of major.
And we can't say that it's a special use. Because now we're not denying it, right? I know we're cutting hairs, right? But we're not denying it. We're not saying yes, we're not saying no. We're saying it's a special use and you got to come here.
So the only way to do, well, that gets a little tricky because adaptive reuse is not really a use. It's a redevelopment of a previous use. It's like changing over from commercial to commercial and residential, or maybe just all residential. It could end up becoming a mixed use. That would be like putting mixed use in your use table as a use. It doesn't really, it's not very clean to do that. I suppose in the text of your ordinance, you could tag it as requiring a special use permit, but then you've got to come up with the specific and objective criteria for the special use permit. The problem then becomes the wide variety of different types of adaptive reuse that you could get. It's going to be really hard to get specific and your arms around specific and objective criteria for that, because you might have I have an example somewhere else that I'm working where it's a small church and they're going to convert the bottom floor of the church to commercial and they're going to put 4 units up above. They're not necessarily going to exceed any threshold that would cause them to have to go to a major land development. And then, or you might get the example that you talked about, which is like Home Depot decides to gut the building and put in residences. Those are 2 very different projects and very different standards. I mean, I'm sure that we could get creative if you wanted to give it a special use permit. We could figure out a way to like maybe break adaptive reuse into two different categories of adaptive reuse and, you know, large scale and small scale, and then have different standards for special use permits. So I mean, I think you could potentially get creative, but it would take some work to do that.
It could be just based on square footage, right? I mean, it could be a 20,000 or less or something.
And that's the other thing that we're really recommending as well, because with things like adaptive reuse, and now we have land development projects that are better defined than they used to be. Looking at your subdivision regulations and making sure that you have really strong standards in there for all of these different types of projects, because the easiest thing to do is to have good standards for lighting and landscaping and signage and all of the things that you want to be able to regulate, and then use those standards for anything that's not residential. Anything that's either mixed use or fully commercial, you go to those design standards, and then you as the board have the flexibility to work with the applicant and massage those standards to fit the project as a collaborative effort through the development process.
So you're just saying because the word reuse, just because of that word, we can't do what his idea is because it's.
I'm not
Because of a
saying you
word?
can't do it, I'm just saying that it won't fit in the same way.
Can the word be removed and changed into something, or is that a state word that was put in?
That's
That's now a state word with a state definition.
So what, and part of the word
It's
use,
his idea, he's smart about that. That's
in
what
this
he-
adaptive reuse, you've got a combination of residential use and commercial use.
Potentially even industrial or manufacturing, depending on the district it's in, because when you adaptively reuse the building, the zoning doesn't change. You still get all the uses allowed in the district. You just get to add residential to that at least 50% of the floor area. So you could mix light industry with residential, you could mix any type of commercial you have, depending on the zoning district the building sits in. So
Is there a percentage that has to be?
50% or more has to be residential.
You mentioned that adaptive use was set forth in one of the definitions of permitted use.
It was added to the section on state law that identifies permitted uses. That's where they made the amendment.
In a separate area separate and apart from the definitional section?
I can give you that section.
If you have it, it'd be helpful.
Yep, just give me 1 second. I can tell you. It might take a minute if you want to continue your conversation.
Can I just ask a question?
Of course.
As it stands right now, we have that in there, but there's not really any specific characteristics as to how we would execute the adaptive reuse, right? It's just kind of a blanket term. Right, is that correct?
Yes. Well, it's a little more than that. Adaptive use has a section in terms of indicating what an adaptive, it's a little more specific. It doesn't prevent us, I believe, even if it's adopted, from ultimately finding that a particular project, for other reasons, it's not an appropriate adaptive use. For example, if we were concerned about the health, welfare of the residents because of whatever reason, I don't think we're prevented in that regard from denying a project if we don't, exactly. Well, the bigger question is, can the state, and this unfortunately is a year-by-year situation where they continually take away the powers of the municipality by dictating and micromanaging the definition of zoning, and essentially to be changing the nature and character of a municipality by doing so. And that's the bigger question. And that,
We add
Touche.
more restrictive language that would comply with the state law and maybe restrict even further, not necessarily making it a special use, and maybe alternatively just lay out more characteristics.
See, the problem with that is if you buy the underlying premise that we have to adopt the town ordinances consistent with the state law, to the extent by adding provisions, one could argue that it's inconsistent because you're making more requirements. The attack, of course, would be the attack, of course, is the other reasons that we have available to us. The bigger, my concern is the bigger question, that the state legislature is essentially going to divest a rural municipality from keeping itself rural.
Yeah.
And that's the bigger question. At what point and when is that going to be challenged? As every question of the board member we raise, we have concerns, I think, with what these changes are doing. It sounds like a lot of these changes are taking those qualities away from the town, especially the rural towns.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so
Well, they may not be concerned with the rural towns. They have other issues that they're concerned about.
Yeah, could, the way it's proposed right now with the adaptive reuse in there, could a developer interpret that as I can do almost anything I want perspective? Could they look at, because it goes to whatever they propose, it still goes to the regulations of that particular, I'm just wondering how if we can understand a developer perspective, if they see it the way it is, they say, aha, I have, adaptive reuse, I can do this.
Well, only to the extent 50% is residential,
Yeah.
and the other 50% is something that's either already allowed in that zone, or something that's allowed in that zone by special use permit. Regardless, as long as you adopt the ordinance that allows for them to have to go to your subdivision regulations, that developer has to come to this board.
Yeah, that's certainly, this seems like the best case scenario at this point.
Yes,
They have to go to our regulations, come to the board, so.
correct. And then if you deny it on some basis, let them appeal.
Yep.
But you'll have that mechanism to review the project.
Yep. Right.
If you don't adopt anything, then a developer could come in and say, you didn't adopt anything.
It's
your
wide
town
open.
Council didn't adopt anything.
Yeah.
Anything can go.
Yeah.
And now your planner is dealing with a developer and an attorney saying, well, you don't have anything in place. How do I know I'm supposed to go to the subdivision regulations?
Yep. All right, great, thank you.
Michael?
John, that's under Article 4. It says eligibility, adaptive reuse development must include at least 50%.
Yeah.
That doesn't prevent them from coming in with 60, 70, 80, 90,
Oh.
or
Yeah.
100. Yeah. Yeah. And if I'm permitted by the chairman, later on, I'd like to take a couple of minutes on the latest 15 new bills submitted by the speaker.
Of course.
So to answer your question, what they did with the law was they amended 452437, which is general provisions, permitted uses, and subsection B says, notwithstanding any other provisions of this chapter, the following uses are permitted uses within all residential zoning use districts of a municipality and all industrial and commercial zoning use districts, except where residential use is prohibited for public, health, or safety reasons. And then it lists, and then down at the bottom, they added adaptive reuse. And just to remind you of what we did in your specific regulations is we put a provision down in E and said that the performance standards set forth in Article 6.3 shall apply to all adaptive reuse projects. We're essentially sending them over to your subdivision regulations.
Thank you for that clarification. That was very helpful.
Sounds like the best thing to do right now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So we want to
Zoning.
add both, right? We want subdivision regulations and.
All right, I will put a note in here to update that.
So you want to send the applicant not only to the zoning section about performance standards.
But also the review procedure.
Of your
Right.
regulations.
Yes,
We will
please.
add that. Just want to make sure that we were already.
And while she's making these notes,
Yeah.
what's become a topic of discussion is, from the zoning standpoint, is there's two classes of theories out there right now. People say a special use permit in your town has specific and objective criteria. You have to come up with those specific and objective criteria. We know what they are. You come up with them. Whatever it is, a 10-foot driveway and 8 cars in a drive-through, whatever it is. And there's a theory out there that says if I have my 10-foot driveway and I have my 8-car queue, it's a special use permit, it's allowed. It's a simple thing of checking it off. If I check them off, I get my special use permit. Some people have the theory of it's not that simple. You should be able to vary off of that because maybe you want the drive-through with only 6 cars because it makes sense in that area of town. And some people say, no, it's not simply a check the box. But if you go with the theory of your special use is simply a check the box, then what you do instead is you have to develop more performance standards. So it's almost as if, okay, we're going to allow this, but to give that wiggle room, whether we truly want to allow it or not, although it's a special use may be permitted, if you don't meet the performance standards, you don't necessarily get that use. So there's two theories out there. So that's why you keep hearing the term specific and objective criteria, because the intent, I think, was to say, okay, come up with all these different things for this special use permit, and then you can allow it there. Well, that's an exercise that takes a long time, because you're gonna look at every special use out there and say, okay, what do we really want for this special use in this zone? Or you just say, here's all our performance criteria, and you come up with more and more performance criteria. And that's what they're struggling now with, or arguments being struggled with, because you're getting towns and municipal, and cities and towns coming up with a different approach.
There's another theory that out there that if you don't check all the boxes, you can't get your special use permit. You can't get variance for those, and that's another school of thought that's come up.
I'll say the special use permit issue has probably been the most difficult to implement, just because of the sheer volume of information that needs to get translated, onto paper in terms of specific and objective criteria. And like discussing, depending on where I am, I get different theories of how special use permits and their specific and objective criteria are supposed to work. And so if you can't waive a specific or objective criteria, then it's a very rigid process. And if you can't check the boxes, then you can't have the special use permit. And there's, concern on both sides there. It might be a project that you want. It doesn't benefit the applicant if they could give you 20 feet instead of 25 feet of landscaping, but you can't agree to that. Like that, it just creates a very rigid process. But there, like was said, the other side of it is like, no, you can waive specific and objective criteria. And so we don't even have clarity from town to town in terms of how they're implementing this, because the language isn't there to give specific direction.
So the concern, to Richard's point, is if you meet this special use, the applicant could come in and say, well, where's your specific objective criteria if you made it special use? So as a board, you'd have to come up with all this criteria and send it to the town council to adopt, as opposed to saying, you know what, go to our performance standards, at least we have those in place, because you've got Google room on either side, and you look at development for that. And send them to your major land or minor land development regulations. situations where elements have to still be met.
Is it clear that we can deny something based on failure of food standards?
There's very little that's clear right now, but I think, I mean, I would think that if you have specific oh, you mean on a performance standard?
Yeah.
I think you should be able to. If you say, so there's two different ways to do it. You can keep your special use permits and your specific and objective criteria. They're immovable objects. You cannot waive them. And I would say reserve those for the things that make everyone really uncomfortable and you want some very strong standards that you wouldn't want to waive anyway. And then for the things where you want to have flexibility, you tag them with performance standards, and then you can have that negotiated discussion with a developer. But I would think that if they can't meet a performance standard and they can't provide you adequate mitigation of whatever the issue is by some other mechanism, then that's a ground for denying a project.
That's trying to think of a very different scenario that could be proposed and how we would want to vote, you know, what what we would want in response. And you're just not going to get there.
The variations are unlimited.
Yeah.
It's not possible to draft specific and objective criteria that are not waivable in any holistic manner, because the gas station in one location is not the same as the gas station in the other location in town, on a different road, on a different piece of property, in a different area. You may have come up with very different reasons or very different conditions on that special use, and to say that we can draft a uniform set of them every time there's a gas station is just not realistic. And this is the frustration that everyone is having with this issue, is that it's extremely time consuming to go through the exercise. And it's a huge challenge. I mean, I've got municipalities that have 90 something special use permits. How you draft sets of specific and objective criteria for those is, you know, it could take years.
I got a question. Has anybody talked economics about this? Like, say, Home Depot goes about, the tax base goes out, all that money goes out, we put plat in there, now we gotta hire a plow dryer, schools get going. Has the state considered the burden that's gonna be put on? Can we argue that? That's, I mean, we could have a major, like, fluctuation of cash. I don't know, I'm not an accountant, but I would say Home Depot, there's a lot of money coming from that versus a resident, you know, tax base. It's, you know, it's the economics. I don't see it being helpful. There's no way, it's just, there's no, okay. Nice try.
Please.
Charles, the answer is no.
At this point, should we take up the material that was provided with this week's packages? We had within the package material for us to review and consider was what appears to be changes to definitional terms found in Article D of the proposed new legislation.
That's also on the screen behind you. I'm going to attempt to move through it as we talk. But essentially what we've done here is we've taken your existing Article D of your subdivision regulations, which has your definitions. We have amended the definitions that were changed by the state law to reflect those changes. We have added definitions where they were added. We have deleted definitions where those were deleted. And then we've renumbered accordingly based on how we've inserted, but you'll see that the numbers don't run consecutively because any definition that we didn't touch, we didn't include in the draft. And then the ones at the end, for the most part, are just for renumbering purposes. So I don't know if you want me to go through these individually or just to see if there are specific questions on any of these. There is no wiggle room here. We have just taken state law changes and adapted yours accordingly.
Charlie, you had a question?
Yeah, I know, I got just one question about the officer, administrative officer, how it says that it can be this, that, and that, how is that person, that I realize it should be Mr. Phillips. Suppose, is it, who decides it's Mr. Phillips? Doesn't really say, it could be the dog catcher.
Well, I'm gonna guess your code somewhere or your subdivision regulations
I
somewhere
don't know if it has something
identify.
written in there saying it goes from him to him, this, and that.
So either your code of ordinances or your subdivision regulations should identify the town planner as the administrative officer. And I'll say the difference, and I can't make this thing work, so that actually is the thing that stays on the screen fully, but the difference in the definition is essentially that they have broadened who can sit, really,
Dog catcher.
and that you also now can have more than one administrative officer, which we highly recommend that you have a second person designated, because the burden has shifted from the work, some of the work that you've been doing is gonna go to the administrative officer for their review and approval. So, and all of those things have timeframes on them in terms of when they're received, when they're certified complete, when a decision has to be made, just like the time clocks that are imposed on you, they're now imposed on your administrative officer. So having a second person to be able to fulfill the role in the case of an extended absence, an unforeseen circumstance, or whatever it is a very good thing to put in place, so that if you don't do that, you have some unforeseen situation and Mike is not available, you'll have to go through whatever mechanism you'd have to go through to appoint someone else, and you'll potentially lose time. I mean, if he's gone for 2 weeks, an
Or an illness or
application could
something, yeah.
automatically get certified complete, which is not very much time. We're not talking about months, we're just talking about 15 days. And they're not business days, they're calendar days, so they include weekends. So 2 weeks and the application is complete if he's not here.
So who would make the decision on either the first or second? Has that been, I would just like to see how it's that written, so we can.
I'll tell you what most places are doing is they're designating the town planner as the administrative officer, which is standard. It's not everywhere, but that's the most standard thing to do. And then deciding, is there a second person? Who is that second person? That second person gets designated as an assistant or a backup or whatever, and then he can call on them for help if he needs it, or in his absence, there would be another person already available. But typically your town planner is gonna act as your primary administrative officer. You just need a body, a qualified body, I'll say, to fill the role in the circumstance that he's not available. And in offices where there's only one, I've seen the solicitor designated as the AO. You need a person who can review the plans, who understands the regulations, and who can certify an application and make a decision on it, an educated decision on it if Mike's not available.
Well, that's why I'm worried, because it says any municipal dog catcher because of this.
Yep.
That's what I'm worried.
That's what the state law says. What you do in practice can be different, but that's the definition by state law right now.
Is there any way that if the administrative officer, the planner, isn't available, that it can go back to the planning board as a whole?
No.
Okay.
You could designate your chair
Yep.
as the AO,
Yep.
but you can't default to sending it to the board, because technically the board doesn't have authority over that application. Like if it's a minor subdivision of 3 lots and the state law says it's the AO, you have no authority over that application. You can't make you can make a decision on it, but it's not binding, because you don't have the authority to review and approve those applications anymore.
But if you don't put a second and third in there, you wouldn't have an administrative officer if that planner wasn't available.
Then you default on the application, which is what we're trying to encourage people to
Yeah.
not do.
But it does state here that it's the chair and then the employee of the municipal planning departments. So it is, we do have that. I'm seeing that in there at the end of administrative officer.
Yep.
So we kind of have it, we have it in there. It's not left loose.
So,
John, are you inferring that the chair would be the secondary administrative officer?
According
if
to
the
what,
primary is not
according
available?
to this underlying section, it is.
I read it a little different. I read it that the chair may be,
maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
it's ultimately, I think,
That was my original question. I want to make sure we have this straight.
I-
So we don't have an argument.
So I think what we could do is we could probably, if the solicitor agrees, we could probably take that last sentence and reinstate it at the end of the definition, so that you would read consistent with the state definition of the administrative officer, and then you could keep your last sentence that says, the administrative officer shall be designated by the planning board, and it would continue that sentence till the end, and then that means you're appointing Mike, and you can appoint another person. So
And
you
see-
could make a decision to do that.
the definition's even broader. It says a member or chair of the planning board.
Yep.
So,
That's why I think it's important that we get it.
but I think the point is that we got to be clear in who we ultimately, who has the authority hierarchy, town planner, then backup, something like that.
Yeah.
So there's no argument. So you get forward. I don't know, you want to.
I don't know if that doesn't necessarily come here in the definitional section, but it,
Or either you discuss it and put it in its definitional section.
That's what I was thinking.
Could adopt it, or you just have to, at one of your meetings, put it as an agenda item and decide who you're going to appoint and who you're appointing for a planning position.
I think it's important. That's why when I read that, I said to myself, it's chaos. I mean,
Who is it?
who is it? Yeah.
So what I'm gonna do is despite the fact that we struck that last sentence, I'm gonna reinstate it at the end of the definition that we inserted. So you'll preserve that language, and you'll be able to make those appointments as the planning board.
And it wouldn't just go to the town manager and let Randy bring in the people to advise him on whether or not it's approvable or not.
Who to appoint after the planning?
No, if Mike's not available, why doesn't it just go to Randy and let Randy bring in people to kind of fill him in, whether or not Mike's assistant or whomever. But then he would actually have the official authority to kind of do it, to approve it or not.
You could, you'll have to make that.
Talk to Randy about it.
You have to make that as an amendment. No, it's,
Yeah. it's
you
not a
just
bad idea.
can't have Randy, you can't just be the town manager's position, you would have to have that as part of the
We have to
decision
vote on
made.
it too.
Or you'd have to vote on
put it on
it.
the agenda.
My note already that I'm making is, I think, we put it as a planning board agenda item, but every year that you do elections,
What do you want to say?
also do a discussion that night of elections for who the alternate person is, because it could change every year. Perhaps you want the chair right now because it's Jim, but maybe next year Jim's not the chair and nobody else wants it. You can appoint somebody else. And that way you have that discussion each year with your elections.
And then the hire at the end of the year, appoint somebody else. That's not good politics. That's why that person that you're gonna appoint is gonna be stepping up.
you're just talking in jest, I hope. Are you?
See the lack of hair?
Mr. Chairman.
Oh. Joe, you have a question?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. Number one, I would assume, or I would think that Mike could make a recommendation as to who could take his place in the event he is unavailable, and bring that recommendation to the board so that we can put it on an agenda item to address it. That'll take care of this issue.
I'll discuss with Dave and other, and Randy about who, you know,
Yeah.
obviously do Because, you know, the zoning official comes to mind, because we're right next to each other, we often collaborate on stuff, so maybe a zoning official or deputy zoning official.
Sure. That might solve the problem. Second question I have is this. Last week, last meeting, it was last week, we did approve some provisions that were brought before us, but we also rescinded one. Okay.
Yeah, and I assume that should be readdressed
Yes.
today based upon the research that was performed by counsel for the board.
I'm bringing it up because I didn't want us to.
No, I know it was an area that we wanted to hold pending further education on the issues, so part of a vote, do we want to vote on each particular ordinance that we're looking at, or do it all at the end? Any general?
Maybe each one, because it's not that many
Okay,
votes.
okay.
so-
So other than the adaptive reuse ordinance, was there any others that we held or rescinded? Okay,
I think you held non-conforming lots.
on the what?
Non-conforming
Forming.
lots. And we're just to remind you, those two are recommendations to the town council. What we're looking at now and the rest of what we need to look at tonight are your regulations, so those are your purview. So you don't have to send any of this to the council.
Okay.
But the same proviso that it's got to be consistent with, even though it's our regulations, it's got to be consistent with the changes in the state statute. Okay,
Yes.
all right. So,
Something substantive that's at the state level on their subdivision plan statutes, yes.
so do we have a motion regarding the adaptive reuse change in ordinance that we reviewed and rescinded last week?
I'll make a motion to accept the adaptive reuse as recommended per our conversation about sending it to the land regulations and, what was the other? But
The other was non,
performance standards, yes.
do we have a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Joe would tell us.
All not in favor?
Aye.
The ayes have it. Do we have a motion with respect to the ordinance regarding changes to non-conforming use?
I'm trying to remember, is there anything?
Would you like to be refreshed?
Yes, yes. I could.
Could we have a refresh, Jen, without getting
Can it be
into?
a short refresh? Okay.
So the language that was before you was a change for non-conforming lots these are pre-existing lots of record where they do not comply with the size requirements in the zoning district. So this is a 10,000 square foot lot in a 20,000 square foot minimum district, and what the law says is that there's an automatic proportional reduction of the setbacks applied to that lot.
And I don't think we have any flexibility in to that side of it, right? I mean, in terms of saying,
The proportion,
yeah,
You have no control over what the proportional reduction
Yeah,
is.
yep.
It's automatic.
this is the one though, when you actually do the calculation.
Yeah, it's backwards.
It's backwards.
yeah, you mentioned that, yeah.
It's making a bigger lot with more setback versus the small lot.
Yeah, yeah.
So you'll be probably adopting another amendment.
To that at
next
some
year
point.
Okay.
To clarify.
And, to be clear, we raised that issue not to tell people to do the calculation incorrectly, because that gives you an absurd result, and you don't interpret the law to give you an absurd result. But just to make sure that everyone is aware that if you read the specific language, it directs you to do the calculation backwards. We don't expect anyone is actually going to apply it that way.
Right.
but you should be aware.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we approve the ordinance amending zoning, Article 3, non-conformance.
We have a second.
Second. Can I
All-
have discussion from?
Discussion, sure.
So the, so a non-conforming piece of property with, say, very little road frontage, that could be, you'll be able to build on it because you would basically be shrinking proportionally the road frontage to make it comply.
So you raise an interesting point that I typically don't get into, but since you asked the question, these are pre-existing lots of record. So these are legal lots that, for the most part, probably had the zoning changed after they were legally created. And so now they're non-conforming because they're not big enough for the district that was slapped on top of them. Road frontage is road frontage. Like, we can't change road frontage. There's no proportional reduction of road frontage. It is what it is, but the language in the law set includes road frontage as part of the discussion of what dimensionally gets reduced. These lots, if they are a pre-existing non-conforming lot of record, they can get a building permit anyway, regardless of whether they have enough road frontage or not. The issue is what setbacks apply to them. Like, what does their building envelope look like? And if you apply the building setbacks for, and these are a bit of an extreme example, but not to say this isn't happening, if you're in a 3-acre zone and you have a 10,000 square foot lot that was created way before that zone was put on top of it, you're gonna have a building, you're gonna have setbacks that basically cross over each other and don't create a building envelope. There is no space. So the idea here is to do a proportional reduction. Really what matters are the setbacks that create the building envelope and the lot coverage, because setbacks get reduced, lot coverage gets increased proportionally. Road frontage is road frontage. It's in there, but it really doesn't
So it's just
matter.
getting flattened and squeezed.
What's that?
Just getting flattened and squeezed.
You're basically squeezing your building envelope down proportionally to how non-conforming the lot is for the district it's in.
But if like zoning would have this come up a lot, where they'd have a 20,000 square foot, we'd say you need 100-foot frontage, they all had 50-foot frontage lots, they would come in at 50 feet of the week, because they're like, look, we can build on this, we can make sure it's okay. So taking her thought process forward, instead of now having to go to zoning, they come to building and say, I have a 10,000 square foot lot, and a 20,000 square foot zone, essentially a 50% reduction. Well, I need 100 foot normally, but I got 50. Well, I am on the 50% less lot, at 10,000 instead of 20. Give me the 50% reduction for 50 foot. And then building official, administrative official will say, okay, go forward. They don't need to go to zoning now, where they're now subject to a zoning board and the elements of the variance.
You can do a fire like that, I don't know, fire alarm, but there's a fire ordinance.
There's building code won't let you build closer than 5 feet to a property line unless you firewall. If you firewall, you can build to the lot line.
Any further discussion? Do we have a second to the motion?
John,
Yes, I did. I did second.
We did have a second? Okay, I'm sorry. All in favor? Aye. All not in favor? All right, the ayes have it. Does that take care of last session's unfinished or rescinded business? Back to the definitional section, to the amendment of the town ordinance that pertains to the planning board. Any further questions of any board member regarding the change in definitions? Go ahead, Michael.
Just one, Mr. Chairman, on, let's see, it would be under the I guess, number 56, land development project. I noticed that conservation development is out on that definition.
It's not cluster development.
Yeah.
I don't understand.
I don't understand that either, Michael. Yeah,
I asked actually the same question.
I don't know the logic there. I mean, the only, I'll say, it says including but not limited to, so it would still include conservation development if you wanted it to. I don't know what the rationale was for that.
okay, yeah, I didn't either, so it's,
I don't think there'd be a problem adding that if you'd like to add that, because it's not taking away from
Yeah,
anything.
it doesn't prohibit conservation development, so.
no, I was just curious as to, well, this whole mentality behind this thing, it makes me question if there's something behind it, but.
If there is, I do not know what it is.
Yeah.
But we can simply just unstrike the words in
Okay.
for conservation development, because it's not prohibited to be conservation development.
Well, I just know that this board in concert with guidance from a town planner, put together a conservation development ordinance that we're very proud of, so I just, yeah, I think I'd like it back in, please.
Back in,
Actually,
yes,
definition with respect to the developmental plan review is, there's two types that they can have, it's formal and
informal.
informal. Does that need to be defined? Do you need to define,
So that's,
is that?
the difference between formal and informal is not defined in state law. It's up to the municipalities to determine what they qualify as an administrative or formal development plan review. So it's not included in the definition for that reason.
And so the board knows that if a project is going to be reviewed under the developmental plan review, which is one way a project can be reviewed, you're accustomed to land development project, minor or major projects. If it goes under developmental plan review, there's two types, there's informal. So if you designate any project as informal, it's reviewed by your administrative officer, and it never sees the board. If you designate the projects as formal developmental plan review, then they have to come to the board for at least one stage.
Keep it formal.
One stage.
One stage of development.
Keep it formal, so we at least see it once.
With final to the administrative officer. So if you're concerned with having the ability to look at these projects, developmental plan review projects, you would want to have a formal review. That way they come to the board. If you don't care, and you're happy with whoever your administrative officer is, then it would, informal for a project, it would be up to him or her.
Mr. Chair, I like the idea of seeing it at least once, in my opinion.
What's everybody else believe?
When you look at the definition of what, and sometimes it's like a change of a use of a property, think in a strip mall, we have a bunch of strip malls in town, when a new business comes into one of the malls, you want to see that.
Can we, is there a way to specifically design, describe informal or list? I mean, it's unusual because things are gonna fall off that list that you're not,
It used to fall under, a lot of those would fall under a special use permit.
Yeah.
And they'd go to your zoning board,
Right.
and they'd look at it from a special use. The tattoo parlors coming in, the coffee shops coming in, the gymnasiums coming into the strip mall. It would be a special use, zoning board would look at it, make sure there was a local board level of
I guess it's the,
That's how it used to be,
Yeah.
now because they've changed special use permit,
right.
changed. So,
I guess it's the decision on whether it's formal or informal, who makes that decision?
You have
You do.
to, you have to state in the
What-
regulations, you
Yeah.
have to state what qualifies as an administrative and what qualifies as a formal.
Hey, Mike, is it possible that you could put recommendations of what could be informal?
Yeah, I think under, if you look at that definition, A, one I just brought up, a change in use of a property where no extensive construction improvements is sought. I think that covers, I think that should probably be the only thing that is informal.
Yeah.
Everything else,
Yeah, because that statement would cover anything really taking place outside the change of use, so.
So there's, I don't mean to confuse the issue, but there's a bit of a wrinkle in this. Well, so the changes that they made to development plan review have made it almost identical to minor land development, with the exception, that your solicitor raised, which is a formal development plan review application can be designated to go to the planning board as the permitting authority, but a minor land development application is not. Oh, the only way it's coming to you as the board is if either there's a street creation or extension, or they're triggering unified development review through a variance or a special use permit. There is a change to the proposed change to the language for development plan review right now. I don't know what's going to happen with it, but most of the feedback that I've gotten in terms of, well, what do we do about this fact that development plan review is overlapped by minor land development in almost all circumstances. When you look at the two lists of what qualify, minor land development essentially covers almost everything. Everything you could think of. I've tried to come up with a project that wouldn't fit into one of those categories, and I haven't heard one yet. And when you read the language, it says minor land development is any one of the following. When you read development plan review, for developments including but not limited to, so it's kind of a little more soft, and the conservative reading of that is it's minor land development first, and if it's not minor land development and it doesn't fit in one of those categories, only then can you make it development plan review. Again, that's an interpretation question on how you read that language, but if that's the thinking, I haven't thought of something that would fit in development plan review over being minor land development.
so if we have both on the books, the developer could say it's a land development project.
I think,
How would we counteract?
I don't know how you could. If you look at the two definitions side by side, two of the requirements to be that type of project are identical. So you can't be both, because the law specifically said you can't make them go through both, because communities used to make you do minor land, like a land development project and development plan review. You can't do that anymore. But if I am an adaptive reuse project located in a commercial zone where no extensive exterior construction of improvement is sought, which one am I? Because I'm listed in both.
Can I make a suggestion, just take a vote on it, whether we want to put it in, or not put it in?
Put what in, informal?
So just before you talk about that, what I will say is, for consideration, they changed the Zoning Enabling Act to say that you shall have development plan review. It used to say may. It did not change the Subdivision Enabling Act, and they left that as you may have development plan review. So the two acts don't reconcile with each other. One says shall, one says may. Again, conservative reading, zoning trumps subdivision, you have to have development plan review. There is a bill that has been introduced that will take the shall in zoning and turn it back to a may. So that development plan review will become an optional procedure. Whether that passes, who knows, but that is the current state of affairs for development plan review.
But would having what Mike read, the change of use, does that confuse the issue more if that's formally in place as informal? With everything you just said?
It really, I have to go back to your solicitor and ask, and not to put you on the spot and answer this now, but this is probably something that we should talk about in terms of what the interpretation is, and is it minor land development first and can only be development plan review if it's not minor land development? That depends, how we word that depends.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to see it, get some educated information on that, if we could. That's my,
That seems a reasonable request.
yeah.
Well, and part of it too is the intent of the board is you want to see more projects than not see projects.
Yeah.
That's the read I get from the board, Jim.
I think
So you
that's,
have a little more idea of what's happening.
I think that's correct, but Mike had a good point about change in use, where, I don't know if we want to get into that. One suggestion I think Mike mentioned was formal review for all that's in the definitional exception, definitional section, with the exception of section A.
So I'll just offer too that you're gonna have some more time to think about this, because the only thing we've done so far is put it in your definitions. We're still drafting your section on development plan review that will go into your regulations. So there's plenty of time to, well, I won't say plenty of time, but there's time to consider this a little bit more and give, you know, Mike feedback, or ask Mike to, you know, make some suggestions, and then we can come back to you with a draft that will be the development plan review section of your regulations. This is just the definition right now.
Mr. Chairman, you're looking for a motion to table?
Are you looking for us to vote on the definitional section, or should we wait?
That's up to you.
If we-
I'm just saying that the structure of development plan review is yet to come. We haven't gotten there yet. This is just the definition.
So approval of the definition isn't gonna change what we can do with formal, informal.
That's,
Okay,
the definition is from state law, and
Okay.
that's it.
Let's vote.
You okay with that, Joe?
yeah,
Okay, we have a motion.
Second.
We need the motion first.
well, are we doing a motion on all the definitions?
All the definitions, the one amendment we do have, Michael suggested
Ag conservation development.
Line 79 on
Yeah,
page 2.
and I also
page three.
added your sentence on it, the administrative officer, about who makes that selection, and I added that back in.
All right, I'd like to make a motion to accept and approve the section 1 general on definitions with the added language of conservation that Michael brought up. And
the addition with respect to
The administrative
the.
officer.
the-
Administrative officer.
Yes.
yes,
Any discussion? Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All not in favor? The ayes have it.
You just make sure you have the.
It's in the middle of the paragraph.
this whole thing. You're just like, I don't know what was going on.
The last sentence that was struck is just coming back at the end.
I think what we have next in our packet is proposed changes to section 3 of the ordinance.
Don't say it because I just added these by accident. I don't even know how. It was on the thumb drive that you gave me. So this is on section 3 of your subdivision regulations, where we have the procedures for submission of land development and subdivision. And we have amended each of your types of review to be consistent with the state law changes. So I don't know if you'd like me to go through these by section, we can do that, or if you, how you would like to go through.
So basically, we just have the part where minor is getting bypassed, we're getting bypassed on minor. It's really the biggest thing, right?
So there's a couple of substantial changes. One is that the threshold for minor was raised.
Yeah.
So we went from 5 lots or less to 9 lots or less. Minor land development got a very specific definition, and now there is a clear threshold between minor and major. Previously, the law read that minor land developments could only be residential in nature, and now that's changed significantly. So now there is a whole host of different types of non-residential types of development that would qualify as a minor. Anything that is over the threshold listed in the definition of minor moves to major. And that's basically the definition of major, is anything that's not minor.
Yeah.
That could be like 9 storefronts.
So on a commercial threshold, it's 7,500 square feet of gross floor area. Up to that point, you're administratively reviewed. Beyond that point, you come to the board.
So the question was raised, does we want to go through each provision with each amendment, or should we ask for a review of the most significant impact changes as opposed to the line by line or change?
I recommend the most significant.
I agree.
All right, so.
Yes.
So, Mike?
Yeah, I'll go along with that. Also, if there's questions by the board members on something that they've read in here.
Yeah.
Of course.
So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go through my pages and I'll call out like the significant stuff, and then if anyone has questions on that specific stuff, stop me and we can go through that. The first page is just kind of restructuring how a project gets classified. This is, clarifying in writing about the certificate of completeness. Let's see. So we didn't really make changes on an administrative subdivision because nothing there changed for state law, except we changed the technical review committee, and Mike had asked you to look at number 6 and make sure that I wasn't reading that incorrectly. And you can let me know if I was later on. And then on minor, again, this is some just clarifying language in terms of how you classify the project. We've added into minor where necessary that the permitting authority is either going to be the planning board or the administrative officer. So you see a lot of like or administrative officer language added, because depending on whether or not there is street creation or unified development review, the permitting authority is either or in those. Under minor, we added language about how you process an application when it includes unified development review, so that that's very clear how those applications get processed.
I'm sorry, could just, question on 6 as far as review by technical review committee. So shall to may. So who determines may? Michael? Okay.
So our recommendation is to make that a may, so that he has flexibility in terms of what can go before the technical review committee and what he doesn't feel like he might need help on. If he's got a 1 lot, straightforward subdivision, they meet all the requirements, there's probably not worth the time of the technical review committee, and he should be able to just process that application. So we do suggest that you consider making that a may and giving Mike the flexibility to use the TRC as he needs to.
I've always had the ability, if there was something complicated involved in administrative, I could always deny it, and it would automatically come to you as a list of minor leagues.
I personally found it very, helpful. One of the first things I read is that, because I'm
Yeah.
What is it?
No, I mean, communities are gonna be leaning heavily into TRCs now. Places that did not have them before are now establishing them, because without the planning board, there is no other mechanism for him to get to sit around a table and review a set of plans and talk through issues, so. Absolutely. So that brings us down to line 111 on page 3. This is where you have input. So what the law says is that you can allow the administrative officer to grant waivers to the requirements if you state what the waivers they can grant are. You don't have to give authority, but you can if you want to. So this is a place where I've left a prompt for you to consider. If you want to allow the administrative officer to grant waivers, we have to list what they can waive. If you don't want to, then we just remain silent on it. But I've seen things like, interior lot angle requirements, sidewalk requirements, landscaping stuff, lighting things, that if an applicant is before the administrative officer for review and they feel that it's in the best interest of the town and the application, they can grant waivers on certain things.
What's the town planner's take on this?
I would think, what she mentioned, like the interior angle, when it's one we always grant, and it's a silly one, I think, we have an angle over 200 degrees.
Yeah.
My point is, would you like to have that ability? Because it sounds like the town planner is going to be the officer.
Well, yeah, I think there's only a few waivers in the subdivision reg, that interior lot angle is one of them. Street width is one that we always grant, and we've got to just change our road standards. We're going to be coming up with a private road standard. I think that's something that I could do, with the interior lot angles, but everything else, like whether leaning sidewalks and stuff, I mean, that's a policy thing that.
So if we leave it as is, you would have it would be the option to do those things?
No, he
We
doesn't.
have to list
You have
those.
to list them, okay.
Yeah, I'll come up with I'll go through the subdivision.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of them in there that are, the interior lot angle, with, and I'm sure there's some other little ones that carry on. You got things like the angle of a pitch in a cul-de-sac, 2%, people always asking for waivers of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'll go through it and look at it and come up with all this.
Yeah, if we can do that, that'd be, seems like.
So
Right.
we'll add that list once Mike generates it, and this is gonna come back to you anyway, so you'll get to see that list and decide on it. Let's see. So this, again, more cleanup language. Let's see. So we did strike some language on the technical review committee. Here, we are gonna look at, I'll talk to Mike and your solicitor too. You're gonna enable, you already have the technical review committee enabled, so we probably don't even need to mess with any of that.
Michael,
So we had to make the changes so we're on number 5, it's line 152 on page 4. Because they've changed the way a technical review committee, like what their role is, it's no longer a thing where if the planning commission doesn't approve it, goes to if the technical review committee approves it, it goes to the board as a recommendation, so we struck it.
can I ask one question? If the technical review committee is going to become not powerful, but much more, you're seeing more projects, do we have the right mix of people on the technical review committee? Is there anybody missing, any type of person missing from the technical review committee that we should change the makeup or add or delete or,
I mean, we have, I think, all the key people there, the engineer, zoning official,
fire department?
fire department is the key one, and they're going for the board. I mean, we also have land trust, conservation, historical district people. More times than not, they're not attending. I don't even know if
So the
We do
law,
have
the law changed in really actually opened up who can sit on a technical review committee. You can even appoint a member of the public now. So you can have planning board members, you can't constitute a quorum of your board, but you can assign a planning board member or more than one, as long as you don't constitute a quorum of your board. What I've seen done most commonly is to use the standard people that you would have at a technical review committee that Mike just ran through, and then only one place have I seen an appointed member of the public. The argument on the other side of that is that this is a technical committee and it should not just be, Joe Schmo off the street who says they don't like stuff. This should be a technical level review.
Exactly.
In the place where they did appoint a member of the public, they had a requirement that that person have experience in certain fields that were associated with land development. But we'll look, we haven't gotten there yet, but we'll look at your section that establishes your technical review committee and any changes that we can make to broaden that for you, that you can add people to, we can do that. Language we've added in other places basically said that at the request of the administrative officer, who's the chair, they can pull in any expertise necessary in order to do the review. So if you have, if somebody that's not specifically listed and some specific issue comes up, they have the ability to get someone to join the conversation.
Okay.
Actually, I had a question on the next line, 163.
Reassignment to major review.
So this is under the plan.
Yep.
Should this read, permitting authority may reassign a proposed line to major?
Yeah, it probably should, but I bet you the law doesn't.
Only because they're not gonna have a chance, for the most part, the planning board has very limited chance to see a minor development and then send it to a meeting. My suggestion to the board would be looking at line 163 to consider making that a permitting authority. Is that
Yeah.
permitting authority?
Yep.
As opposed to the planning board?
Right.
And I do have to make some other tweaks to the last part of the sentence, but it's just grammatical stuff to make it read correctly.
Everyone good with that modification?
Permitting authority?
Permitting
authority.
authority.
Okay.
Everybody good?
Yep.
Okay. Okay.
So then we've just updated in section 7, your decisions for preliminary plans.
Did the time period through the process change at all?
Not this past
Okay.
time, no. So I think all of your time periods were updated. The only place I might have found something different was the difference between the 10 and 14 days for recertification, which was in the law, but they fixed that. So,
Did they take it out again?
no. No, it's in there. 10 days, no less than 10 days. Yep, it used to be, they made changes last time around, and they changed major to no less than 10 days, and they didn't change minor. They left it at 14 and gave you more days, and so this past time they fixed that. So I think we fixed that in yours, because otherwise your time clocks were all up to date. So then Article E is major. plan development and major subdivision. And we just adjusted the language to mimic the way the state law lays out the stages of review.
Which line is that?
So that
Section E.
starts
Section
on
E, page 5,
Page
198.
5, yep.
The section you're talking about is 204.
I'm sorry?
The section you're talking about is line 204.
Yes. Yep. So the biggest change with major is that the public hearing moved from the preliminary plan stage of review to the master plan stage of review. So you now hold your public hearing at master plan. At preliminary plan, there's no more public informational meeting. It doesn't exist anymore. At the preliminary stage, there is no public hearing, but there is a requirement to notice abutters.
That sounds weird. You notice the butters, but they're not allowed to react to the,
This is, she is absolutely right. This is a major shakeup. I really feel like I'm in first grade again with all this stuff.
My
Somebody pulled a
question-
rug out from underneath me. But yeah, it changes the way this board conducts.
changes that whole procedure.
So,
I think it's good that they changed the public hearing to master plan, because that's, where really, you're investing a project at master plan. That's when
like I said,
you allow
Go ahead.
decisions, well, we don't do public, full public notice anymore, so it's not certified mail, but.
so I'll say that my understanding is that the thought process behind this was to get the public involved earlier in the process. To get them out at the master plan so that they get that public hearing notice. At master plan, they provide their input and feedback. The board obviously the applicant can read the room there in terms of what feedback is being given and how the board is reacting to it, and they can make decisions on whether or not they alter their plans, and then engineer those conceptual plans at master plan, in a different way than they might have if they didn't get the public feedback until the preliminary stage where everything is technically pretty much engineered. The original concept was that there was going to be nothing at preliminary, and I argued against that and got them to at least put in the requirement for notification, because the reality of the situation is there is not a planning board in Rhode Island that is going to come at a preliminary plan where the public got a notice, abutters got a notice, and then somebody stands up and the planning board says, well, I'm sorry, this isn't a public hearing, so we're not going to hear from you. Can't speak. That's never going to happen. So it's a de facto public hearing anyway. It's just not the formal advertisement of a public hearing. They're still getting a notice, they're still gonna show up, and you're all gonna still recognize them and let them speak.
Mike, I got a question.
I have a question on that.
One at a time.
So-
Hang on, one at a time. We'll go with Charlie, Joe, and Michael, just to be around me.
My question to you is, how do we fight these things? And one thing I see is a negative impact on the facility of them. Like, for me, it's the only way we can fight any major thing that I see is a negative impact in the area, correct? I'm looking, I hate to say this, but I'm just trying to figure out how, if something bothers the people around here, how can we stop it? What pieces of paper do we have on this thing? And so what does that mean, the definition of that,
Which one are you reading?
I skipped over into the negative impact on the project facility.
What line are you on?
698.
You're way ahead of us.
Where's the
You're-
chart?
But it's still in the same, that's what I'm saying. It's in the same developments, and we're talking about major changes, major developments.
We'll get there.
Yeah, let's take one section at a time.
I'm just trying to figure out how to fight this.
Well, I understand. Joe?
My concern is this. When we're dealing with the de facto thing that it's going to happen regardless of whether or not you call it a public hearing, are we going to be in violation of the open meetings notice requirements that require us to advertise a particular issue that's coming before the board. And, and when you allow people to talk on that subject, okay, is somebody going to be able to challenge us and say, you never gave us, anybody else in the community, the opportunity to be heard on that subject because you didn't advertise it?
So you're still advertising the preliminary plan by way of posting it on an agenda that's posted
It's not
in
certified.
the standard places it's
Yep.
posted. That's notice.
Okay.
The law now says that the requirements for advertising the public hearing happens at the master plan stage. So you're gonna meet all those requirements there. And then at the preliminary plan stage, it says that the abutters have to get noticed. Abutters only have to get noticed. So that notice will go out. And it's at the discretion of the chair as to whether or not he recognizes someone in the audience on an agenda item that is other than a public hearing. At a public hearing, you have no choice. You have to recognize the public. On other agenda items, you don't have to recognize the public, but I've never seen a board not do that. Like,
I understand what
So-
you're saying. I'm not suggesting that we deny anybody
Yeah.
the right to talk. What I'm suggesting is that somebody comes up with a novel theory that says, you never told us that we would have the opportunity to talk at that stage of the
I see
agenda,
what you're saying.
okay? And therefore, we're going to object to it and bring you to court on that subject matter.
If you make an announcement at master plan that, you're not gonna get, general public is not gonna get notice of this at the next stage.
Well, I mean, that's a way to do it.
And we have to make an announcement that.
Just the butter in
No,
the agenda.
Yeah, the agenda.
Right, but it's not gonna be, newspaper notice.
That's, I mean, my only concern is to make sure that we don't run afoul of the notice requirement. And somebody can't come back to us later on and say, I never had an opportunity to talk because I didn't attend that particular public hearing. I came to the one that was not a public hearing, and I had an opportunity to talk, but my abutters, my neighbors never got notice to come.
I don't think the town would be running afoul of the open meeting notice. The person making that argument may have a legitimate argument to appeal the board's decision for what happens that night at that hearing and appeal it on their individual basis, but it won't necessarily be improper open meetings violation.
Okay.
They possibly could make some sort of constitutional argument as to notice for that first stage.
That would be appealed to the state, though.
Goes to Superior Court.
Goes to Superior Court.
Superior Court would then review the notices, the state law, and that person's argument as to what type of notice they claim they would have needed at that first stage to satisfy proper notice of their rights as a resident.
One would think this issue has come up before, irrespective of the new changes. Not necessarily with the town of Smithfield, but other municipalities.
I really don't know, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, without doing research, of course. Yeah, but I'm sure this issue,
The one thing that does come up is, that used to come up was that zoning, they were reviewing appeals for your decision. What I do at the zoning level, I've done in the past is, we made an introduction, although it wasn't, you didn't get formal notice, but everybody knew about the appeal. What there was a public meeting, we allowed the public to speak, so long as they kept it within the framework of what's allowed on the appeal on that date. So they just couldn't come up at that date and say, well, I want to talk about this point and that point that was brought up at the plan, but they could only come in and argue the facts that were already developed. And it allowed us a limited public speech. That has been, that's pretty much held up in some fashion. No one ever complained or filed a violation of how I handle those
Michael, you had a question?
So at preliminary, this board and the public gets presented with more advanced designs, engineered plans, and a lot of more questions can be developed. We've had people come before this board with their own engineered related questions. And my question is, does a formal public hearing carry more legal weight than opposed to someone who just comes before this board and say, hey, my engineer or my architect or my planner findings contradict what has been presented to this board, and I object to it. So what kind of weight is held by that? And what if we have a chairman who doesn't allow any public input?
At the end of the day, you're the finder of fact.
Say again? I didn't hear.
We're the
Well,
finder
that's
of fact.
true, to some degree.
You determine who's expert in believing it, you know.
No, I think what Mike's saying is the butter or resident of the town that they're expert going to be allowed to present.
And we've had that on a number of occasions.
Well, is there any prohibition from us adding the right to a public hearing at that phase if that's the general feel of the board that they would prefer to allow that to?
I don't think you can go beyond what it innate, so there's been a lot of conversation about like, okay, so we don't have a public hearing anymore, but what if I still wanna advertise it? Or what if we still wanna hold a public hearing?
We find out for sure?
I don't, well, nobody knows for sure because this is new and it hasn't been tested yet, but, you know, could the town take it upon themselves to do some kind of additional notice in addition to what the minimum requirements are? Yeah, but you're gonna pay for it. You can't make the applicant pay for it. They only have to pay for the minimum. Could you hold it as a public hearing? I think you're wading into weird territory there because you don't have the authority to hold a public hearing at that stage anymore. I think you could put language right into your regulations that says that at the preliminary plan stage, although this is not a public hearing, the you know, members of the audience will be recognized to provide comment.
Call it a type of informal review.
That might be more troublesome than.
You know, everybody's talked about like, you know, what are ways that we can mitigate this issue? And I'm, you know, just sharing with you some of the things that I've heard.
Michael makes a good point because if the resident has an expert that he wants heard at the preliminary stage, as opposed to the expert of the applicant, that could be the lowest issue that the resident has because they haven't had their opportunity to be heard on the updated.
It's happened before. Yeah, I mean, there's a
Well,
lot of stages between master and preliminary, in a lot of instances, it is a lot of new stuff that no one has seen.
And there's also fairness to the applicant, where the applicant might not be anticipating to be able to deal with that if they're under the impression that there's just.
It's just our expert. And that's it.
So this isn't just not advertising that it's a public hearing, but he wouldn't be saying, okay, that 7 o'clock, public hearing's open. So when does the public know that it's their turn to, you know, come forward without, you know, us starting to take a vote and somebody raising their hand saying, hey, listen, I didn't get a chance to talk.
The whole procedure that you go through for that public hearing process that you're currently doing at preliminary, you're shifting to one phase earlier. And then at preliminary, it's just a meeting. So there is no, it's not gonna read on your agenda that it's a public hearing at that stage. It's just gonna read that it's a preliminary plan application.
But as the chair, you can.
Yeah.
not evidence.
Yeah. So just, if you had a member of the public ask, hey, the preliminary meeting, the plan is coming up, do I have a right to speak? How do you answer that question?
The chair will decide if there will be public comment.
Okay. That's what you're saying then. No pressure.
Well, Joe,
Holding the evidence,
well, the point is, it's not evidence, it's comment,
that's what I'm saying, yeah. So it's-
for whatever it's worth. Joe, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm following up on what Mike has just pointed out. What happens if, in fact, the final plan that's being presented is a substantial change from the original plan that the public hearing took place on?
Well,
That goes
yeah.
back to the planner.
I would, if it's a significant enough change that it would warrant coming back at master plan. If a road changed, a different entrance, different area or something like that, or they're adding more lots or something like that, it would automatically get kicked back to you as a major change in which you would have.
Another public hearing, and who's going to foot the bill for that one? Okay.
Oh, that's a good, I like that part.
So I have a question for you. Are you saying that because it's not a public hearing at preliminary, that an applicant, an abutter could not bring an expert and provide information?
That's what,
I understand that's the question.
no, I think they can.
At what stage?
And is that expert testimony somehow less valuable at preliminary because it's not a public hearing?
No,
Okay,
I don't believe it
that's,
is.
I mean, that's the
Because he
premise I've
hasn't-
worked under as well.
Yeah, the expert for the resident hasn't yet had the chance to review it. I think you've got somebody else with you as a resident, you want to comment on what they presented. There has to be opportunity for that to comment. You can't forego the resident's opportunity,
Right.
because it's the information between that master. So, yeah, I would think you could call a comment, take that comment for how you
Whatever
want to
it's worth.
interpret it, as a factual piece of evidence that's their expert, or it doesn't. And you know, I mean, someone who comes up and say, I disagree with the traffic plan.
Everyone disagrees.
And then they sit down.
We disagree.
That's different than if they stand up and say, here's the issues with their traffic plan. You know, my engineers and the traffic engineers said, here's the points they didn't consider. That's a different type of comment that we would take.
Go ahead.
When you talk about a public hearing at the preliminary stage and how it's not required, isn't it true, though, that we could have an informal review? We call it something else. An informal review as opposed to a public hearing. We afford an extra measure of review, informal review,
No,
and the chair, with notice, and the chair could constrain a little bit the public comment to the relevant issue before it. And then, instead of appearing antagonistic or draconian, it looks better for us as an institution.
well, there's
Still an argument.
defined by statute are just the stages of any plan. So you can't add additional stages in between.
But at the preliminary review, at the preliminary stage, an informal review, which is like a public hearing, we could do that, couldn't we?
Before the preliminary,
At the preliminary level,
an informal review
yeah,
with everybody there.
yes,
That's your preliminary.
That
hearing.
is preliminary.
That's it.
yeah.
All you would do is you would. It's the same thing.
So one thing that I want to mention is that the requirements for submission of items hasn't changed. So at a master plan, you're still gonna get the same level of detail that you're accustomed to. And at preliminary plan, you're gonna get the same level of detail that you're accustomed to.
Okay.
So at a preliminary plan, you're gonna get, it's the same checklist requirements, those are yours to set. The state did not change the content of what master plan contains versus what preliminary contains. They just moved the public hearing to the earlier stage of review. So the public hearing is gonna come in at the conceptual level, because technically master plan is still conceptual. That's when you're still
Right.
getting like, my drainage is gonna be here, but I don't have the calculations for that drainage, and I don't have a permit for that drainage. Then at preliminary plan, you're gonna get all that hard engineering, and you're still gonna have a public meeting. It's just not gonna be called a public hearing, and it's not gonna get advertised like a public hearing.
Okay,
So you'll still do a review, you'll still all talk, you'll still get a TRC report that you can discuss, you'll still be able to recognize the public, you can let the public bring an expert. It's still all there, it's just not called a public hearing
why,
anymore.
why? I mean, I understand the intent of pushing it back and before everybody invests a whole lot of money, I understand that, but why take that extra review? What's the intent of taking that extra review comments from the public at preliminary?
Because you can still affect a change on an application at that stage of review. There's nothing that says that if somebody didn't show up at master plan for the public hearing, but they show up at preliminary and they're like, look what I have. This should change the way this subdivision gets designed. You can still respond to that, and you can still impose conditions on that information. Yes. And again, the advertising requirements are the minimum. If the town wants to decide that from now on, when you have a preliminary plan, you're gonna put it in the paper, you can do that. There's nothing that says that you can't do that. You just can't impose that requirement on the applicant, and you cannot call it a public hearing.
So we have to pay for it?
You do.
Just change the words.
Well, I mean, you're not changing the words. You could put in a notice that says that, the planning board will be hearing a preliminary plan application on the following. Yeah.
So we just change the fees, the application, 500 to 1,000 to cover that and do it.
You're not the first person that suggested that.
We gotta fund the Christmas party some way.
Okay, you ready to move on to the next section?
All right.
Unless somebody pay.
So that's the biggest change with major. Again, we've added language in here to make sure that it's clear what happens when you have a unified development review, and I'm at line 242. So we changed the public informational meeting to public hearing. We've updated the public notice requirements. And in Article G, this is the preliminary plan, so really the only thing we've done here again is clean up language.
Michael?
Can we just really quickly go back to line 323 on page 9? It states, prior to approval of the preliminary plan, an applicant must submit all permits required by the state or federal agencies. Weren't we kicking those down the road to final plan prior to that? At least this
We
board.
left the option, we left the option.
This says must.
I know, yeah, I see that we can't do it.
And the only one that's kind of like left dangling is the DOT PAP, physical alteration permit. So that looks to me like a change in how we may do business. And then in addition, on line 348, public notice hearing, prior to the first planning board meeting on the preliminary plan, a public notice shall be sent to abutters only at least 14 days prior to the meeting. So look at line, if you look at that section 4, line 348, and then go to the next page on 11, it says notice area, property owners, all property owners within 200 feet of the perimeter of the subject parcel. So that would get butters, but in my mind, an abutter is
Contiguous.
line to line.
Yep.
Yeah. So is there,
We've always notified within 200 feet.
yeah,
That's your existing lane.
That's our.
okay. So,
Anyone within 200 feet of any point of that zone.
so we'll get butters, but this 200 feet just covers even further than butters.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, it may pick up, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
all right,
So we need 200 feet.
all right.
Isn't the reality of it that you are an abutter if you're within the notice area?
I was classified as a butter within the 200
Yeah.
feet.
Yeah.
I didn't classify it as a property abutting.
You don't actually have to touch the property to be considered an abutter. If you're within the notice area, you're an abutter. And some
That's
Across
places,
the street.
yeah, and
That's weird, but that's how they define it, I guess.
It's a circle.
Yeah.
Come up with a better word than
Learn something new every day.
And you know, everybody's allowed to pick their own abutters notice area. Exeter,
It's up to 1,000.
Exeter's 2,000.
Yeah, well, they got 4 acre house there.
Still really long abutter lists.
Moving on to notice requirements, anything in there? Page 11.
So that's Article H, starts at the bottom of page 10 and goes on to 11. So we changed all of the notice requirements across all different types of applications got changed to be uniform. So we've amended your notice requirements to match those.
This is remarkable. It changes everything. The state should just take over the planning boards in every town and city.
Oh, please don't say that out loud.
Right?
So then.
Final plan?
Final plan.
Final certification of the length of 3 days of the law. So we can ask them.
You have a call out under final plan under good cause for extensions?
Yeah, so this is the first time I've seen final plan for both types of review combined into one section, and that works. This was, I think, the one place where I got hung up, where I couldn't kind of reconcile the two different finals. The change in the law language is a little bit different between an expiration of approval for a minor and an expiration of approval for a major. Maybe you can look at that and see if you think that this language that's there.
Well, this general issue has come up. We had a matter where good cause was raised, and we had some internal discussion about good cause and how many times that we're going to allow the extension. I don't know if you remember that.
I
So,
do. It's here.
oh, okay. So we had a,
Conveniently.
yes, we had a nice discussion what good cause was and what good cause was not. But I do like allowing good cause, but with that limitation of perhaps 1 year from the period of time. So it gives some closure to avoid some of that debate.
So in the minor, in that language in the law, the minor does not specify a time period, but in the major, it's an extension for 1 year.
is there any prohibition for adding for both? I think to be consistent.
That, like I said, this was the only place where I couldn't make the minor and major line up, so maybe we, David could
Well,
look
mine is
at that
pretty big
and.
though. Well, mine is developed, it's not like we used to think of a minor development,
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Sean.
Yeah, minor isn't.
It's not, so it should be.
It's gonna change.
Something like the planning board may, for good cause, show and extend the period for recording an additional period, but no greater than 1 year from the expiration of the prior application, something along that line.
The general laws, I believe, allow for 2 1-year extensions automatically. So I think you have to account.
That's beyond that.
That's beyond what we recommend.
This is for the final plan. So the two 1-year extensions are at master
Yes.
preliminary.
Not final.
And then you can come back again for good cause. And then the final language is that it's 1 year from the date of approval, unless you record. But you can also grant, for good cause, an extension to the recording of that final plan. But like I said, the language between minor and major is just enough different that I wanted to call that out. So maybe you can look at those two and let me know if you think this language is adequate, or if they can add the 1 year for both of them.
Yeah, I would suggest that just for the simple reason, the size of developments now are bigger than what a minor used to be. Mine used to be, a minor thing, now a minor thing is not minor.
Anything else in the final plan that jumps out that you'd like to raise to the board's attention? Any questions from board members on this section?
We go back to the thing that Mike brought up under Article G, under item D, about what they have to submit, including permits, control items, all that good stuff.
What line are you on?
That is down at 323 E.
Yep.
Because I have to certify complete, and we had this discussion about what the board's leniency is about when people apply for wetland permits. My typical thing is to say you have to have at least comments back from DEM and wetlands that you know you submitted it, you read it, and they're not going to deny it. They understand it. There may be some technical things, but the permit has issues. Do we want to go along that way, or are we going to require that they have permits in hand before you get to see it?
What's your position on that?
Well, the way DEM is understaffed now, permits, 120 days is typical, for some big things, it's 6 months or more. Really doesn't, you're not going to get final until they have that permit in hand, but at least they can get before the board and present their preliminary plan. With the understanding that they're going to have a permit when they submit the plan. I don't know what.
So is this about changing the wording? Like, is the word must have the same legal as shall?
This is just kind of directional to me, I think.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
you
It's
guys want-
state law.
It's state law that they have permits in
It's
the.
the state law added language that says prior to the approval of the preliminary plan, an applicant must
There we
submit
go.
all permits. I don't think you can,
I don't have discretion.
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, then
I
you
agree.
can
So, yeah.
change it out of my hands.
Go ahead, Mike.
Just like so much of this, it's been taken out of our hands, Michael.
There's gonna be a lot of screaming at DEM,
Yeah, I have. It's not unusual that you're waiting for them.
You can tell them that we feel their pain.
Very smart.
Development plan review section.
So I think, just one more thought on that is that, because there was conversation on this when that language was drafted, that in order to get you certified complete for preliminary, you have to have submitted your state permits, but you don't have to have them in hand. Because right now, most checklists say state permits at preliminary, and the, administrative officer as the gatekeeper can say incomplete, where are your state permits? Mike's not doing that on a regular basis, but the idea was to prevent that from happening, because in some places that was what was happening, is you're incomplete, you don't have a state permit, it's on the checklist, you can't, you don't get $200 and you can't pass go till I have your state permit in hand. So this language was along the lines of, you can submit for preliminary without your state permits in hand, but in order to get a decision, you have to have them. So they can start the preliminary plan process with you after submitting, but they can't finish it until they have a state permit that they brought back to you.
But that means Mike can't certify it complete, because once it gets before the board, they're on the clock.
It says in the law that they have to render a decision within X number of days unless state permits have not been provided. Yep, it's automatically extended if you haven't submitted your state permits.
Give them the time frame so we can,
It doesn't,
at that point, we have to get it back before the board within that time frame for their.
it doesn't, but it doesn't have a specific extension. Because
Needs
if
one.
you go to,
It needs one.
Right, because it could be the next day. They show up and say, here's my permit. Your board didn't decide it tonight.
Which case?
The board has so much time to decide, to make the decision
Yes.
after the permit
So-
is silent.
let's use for instance, they come to you, they have not gotten their state permits, you have to extend your time clock at that point, because you've run out of time clock, but they don't have state permits in hand. Best practice is to extend that time clock to like 2 weeks after your next meeting. That way, you have until 2 weeks after your next meeting, even if they come in tomorrow, the day after, you still have until 2 weeks after your next meeting.
Is there a time, the next meeting, we have every 30 days, but
Yep.
every 60 days? I mean, is it?
It doesn't, the law doesn't say, it just automatically extends it. So a best practice would be, when you find yourself in that situation, take your time clock to 2 weeks beyond your next meeting date. And I can tell you from a real world example, never give yourself less than a week. I had someone who knew that the time clock was gonna run out 2 days after the meeting, and they stacked the room and tried to overflow the room and reach capacity so that we couldn't hold the meeting and couldn't render a decision so that they would get a default approval. We outsmarted them, but I've lived the example. Always give yourself at least a week when you extend a time clock.
Well, does that have to be within the ordinance?
I don't think so, no.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, can the practice be that if everything else is in place except the permits that are not finalized, and it's come before the board, can the board give a conditional approval with the authority to the administrative officer to issue the final approval upon submission of the permits?
But it's a conditional approval. You don't actually, the approval doesn't actually materialize as an approval until you've satisfied the condition. It's not an if you never give them the permits, you never get your approval.
Approval.
So, but we've done that. We've done that practice.
Yeah, that's-
But recently we've been saying they must be available to us at final.
So the difference is that final's not coming back to
You'll
you
never see that
anymore.
final.
They've changed the
You'll
law.
never see another final plan. So,
First grading.
That's the way to do it.
so the idea is that at preliminary, this thing should be pretty much buttoned up, and it's just a formality at final. And if he does get a final that is different than what you approved at preliminary,
Sends it
he can
backwards.
kick it back to you.
Right. Right. All right.
But if you can do a conditional, then what's the weight of must?
That's the point too.
Well, I mean, I
You
think
can't
there's,
get final without it.
yeah,
So you
Yeah.
can't, the actual must is.
Yeah, we've always done it that way, so it doesn't,
The condition of never.
Doesn't change
applies.
anything.
The preliminary never gets.
yeah, I mean,
approved.
if you never perfect the preliminary approval by satisfying the condition, you never get a preliminary and you can't go to final.
Good story. All right.
So we were down, where were we?
Developmental plan review.
So we're still in the process of drafting that. We're gonna come back to you with the draft for development plan review.
Okay.
And then what we did with Article K was because Unified Development Review is now mandatory, we added to your existing section. This used to be the section that just talked about precedence of approval. But because now Unified Development Review takes over the issue of precedence of approval when you need zoning and planning, we put these into the same section. We can certainly separate them out if you'd like. But it really only leaves precedent of approval with the language when you need town council approval. So this is explaining Unified Development Review and how that process works. And then we had to do some renumbering on, what was K is now L. And then on Article, what was L, so we crossed out M. We modified this a little bit to be modifications and changes to plans because the language in the law kept repeating itself for every stage of review. You know, this is a minor change, this is a major change, this is the process you go through for minor, this is the process you go through for major. So we just broadened this section to cover all modifications and changes, whether the plans are recorded and approved or whether you're some way midway through the process. If you make a change to any of those plans, this essentially tells you what you have to do. So we got rid of the recorded plats part of it and let this section cover all changes and modifications regardless of where you are in the process.
I have changes to do.
Yeah.
Any questions of the board members?
Is this, we're voting this?
I don't think we are.
I think she has sections that are not complete.
Right. We're not going to be voting today, correct?
So, I mean, you have to have a public hearing to make these changes real. So
So obviously we're not voting.
So I think the idea will be that we'll, yeah, I mean, tell me now if there are things, and I've made notes as we've gone, if there are things that need to get changed, but we'll collect all of them and then you can have.
Well, I think the ones that we've discussed, doesn't sound, again, like we have much leeway, so.
Things here and there,
What's that?
little things here and there.
It's a bigger policy issue than what we're dealing with, apparently. Hey, Anything else that we need to discuss in today's special meeting? And board members, I know, Michael, you wanted to bring to our attention some issues before we wrap up the night.
So our Speaker of the House has introduced his latest 14-bill housing agenda. And there's a number of things on it. I'm sure Michael and our council and our consultant, have you had chance to look at all 14?
Yeah, so we were briefed about what the topic areas were gonna be prior to their release. We're in the process of going through the text. So I'll say what I've said to everyone else is I reserve the right to change my opinion when I read the language because the devil's in the details. But we're not looking at anything close to what we saw last session. I think there are some probably, questionable bills, problematic bills. And then there are some that I'll say I would categorize as generally probably a good idea, but practically I have a lot of questions about how they're gonna implement them. But there's nothing even close to the scale of changes that we saw last session.
Still allowing housing in all zones?
So there is a bill that says that that residential would be allowed in all zoning districts. Yep.
And that owner-occupied properties with accessory dwelling units are not necessarily a desirable thing.
Agreed.
You're getting where I'm going, yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah, so you don't have to live there. You can rent out the primary residence and the accessory could be rented out too. And there is no owner on property.
Not that problem on 6th Place Street.
Okay.
So the Senate differs in their ADU bill. They do have an owner occupancy requirement in theirs, but the House has basically said that
Right.
that's a deal breaker for them.
Yeah.
I don't know where they're gonna come down on that.
Okay.
They're gonna turn the suburbs into Providence and
So,
lived on it.
so again, manufactured homes could be put in all residential areas. They named Smithfield and Coventry and Richmond were the only ones that we don't allow manufactured homes in residential districts. And again, he's saying building apartments above suburban strip malls, one kind of development that might be able to take advantage of this bill, of one of these bills. So it's more of the same, and just wanted to let you know.
Well, and it's an issue that the state legislatures, the Senate and the House of Senators and House of Representatives for each municipality need to vote accordingly.
Yeah.
That's where it
Including us.
begins.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, one last thing is, at the beginning of this meeting, we talked about the comprehensive plan and how much time this town and its citizens, its planner, the planning board, put into this plan, this document that laid out a vision about where you want Smithfield to go, what your town is going to look like 5, 10, 15, 25 years out. So with the superseding, with law saying zoning supersedes this, everything else, but what is actually happening and is that the state is taking control of that plan away from you, and by increments, changing your vision of your town, and what you want it to look like in the future. It's being done in increments and negating that vision of your comprehensive plan. I know it sounds political and everything, but it's not, because that's what I put time and my heart into over the past 25 years. it's what the planner's done, it's what all of you've done. And so I just, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Thank you.
Everybody have a good evening.
We have a motion to adjourn. We have a second. All in favor? Aye. The ayes have it.